But we seem to be on track for a moment of real reckoning, a decision that could fundamentally change how this country works. Today, in a riveting 46-page opinion, a federal judge found he has probable cause to hold the Trump administration in criminal contempt for ignoring his temporary restraining order to either stop planes of detainees from being flown to El Salvador or to turn those planes back around. Judge James Boasberg filed the opinion alongside a short one-page order directing the government to either voluntarily comply with his orders or to submit to the contempt finding and identify who exactly in the administration made the decision to ignore a federal judge. There are a lot more wrinkles here that we're going to have to iron out with some really smart guests in a moment, including more from the opinion, which reads like an edge-of-your-seat drama. But the bigger question here, and the one that stopped me in my tracks as I read this opinion this morning, is what happens if this goes to the Supreme Court? Judge Boasberg sets the stakes as high as they possibly can be. Quote, the Constitution does not tolerate willful disobedience of judicial orders, especially by officials of a coordinate branch who have sworn an oath to uphold it. To permit such officials to freely annul the judgments of the courts of the United States would not just destroy the rights acquired under those judgments, it would make a solemn mockery of the Constitution itself. So fatal a result must be deprecated by all. That, by the way, is Judge Boasberg quoting a Supreme Court opinion upholding judicial authority back from 1809, a specific phrase that Chief Justice John Roberts has also cited in opinions he's written arguing himself on the supremacy of the judiciary. So if this goes to the Supreme Court, which it very well could, as the Trump administration has already said it's going to appeal, how might that court decide? And how big of a deal will it be? I am genuinely unsure. So let's figure it out. Joining us now, MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin, Reuters White House correspondent Jeff Mason, former congressman and senior advisor for Vote Vets Max Rose, and senior writer at Slate covering the courts and the law, Mark Joseph Stern. All right, Lisa, I brought this to you a little bit earlier because I am genuinely unsure because Judge Boasberg sets the stakes so high here, saying the administration defied him, criminal contempt. If the Supreme Court gets this and doesn't agree with him, does that blow a hole in our Constitution?
I would think so, because Judge Boasberg is basically setting a dividing line between before and after. So what he's saying is it doesn't matter that the Supreme Court later vacated his TROs and found temporary restraining orders and found that the appropriate metric of relief is to be found where folks are detained, meaning they had to sue somewhere else other than in the District of Columbia. That means that the ACLU, which has brought this case, is now litigating, for example, in the Southern District of New York, here in Manhattan, and in Texas. But he's saying, while my orders were still in place, your willful violation of what I clearly directed you to do on March 15th, and then your refusal to provide me any answers over a course of opportunities, which he then goes through in detail, that can't be tolerated. And it's hard for me to see a situation, Katy, in which the Supreme Court finds that tolerable as well. It may be that they say, for example, Judge Boasberg should undergo some further fact-finding before he gets to the point that there's probable cause for criminal contempt. One of the things that he contemplated doing at that April 3rd hearing that he last had in this case was having people come in and testify before there was a probable cause determination. It was a little bit surprising to me that he issued this opinion today and said, we're already there, and now I just want to know exactly who's to blame. But I don't think we're at a place where the court is going to say he's crazy, this is not called for, because there was a clear order of the district court that was so willfully, flagrantly, clearly violated by the federal government and specifically the executive branch that I don't know that the court can tolerate it and yet uphold the rights of other district judges around the country to declare what the law is and find remedies for when it's violated.
Mark, I want your opinion on this.
Well, I was at the hearing yesterday in a similar case involving Garcia, and it was notable that the Justice Department attorney there kept sort of dodging when the district court judge asked, will you follow my orders? He kept saying, we'll follow the orders of the United States Supreme Court. And that follows Trump, who himself has said, well, I'll abide by orders of the Supreme Court, but I don't know about these district court judges. I think what Judge Boasberg is doing here is making it very clear first that district court orders are, in fact, lawful orders the government has to comply with, and also sort of staking out a position that the Supreme Court must either back him up or risk defanging the entire federal judiciary's authority. Like Lisa said, if the Supreme Court steps back from this conflict, as it has from previous conflicts with the Trump administration, and tries to find some middle ground or compromise, it really does risk making a mockery of the entire justice system and the very premise that the federal judiciary has authority and powers that are independent from the executive. So Judge Boasberg is, again, really saying here, I have the facts, I have ample evidence that you defied my orders. I am going to start criminal contempt proceedings, which are a big deal, and he threatens to appoint a special prosecutor if the Justice Department won't do it for him, which shows he's quite serious. And then I think sending this signal to the Supreme Court, you guys better back me up, or else this whole ship, the entire judiciary, is just going to sink.
Yeah, so we explain that for a second, because that might not be clear. He's going to hold them in criminal contempt, it seems, and usually that is prosecuted by the Justice Department. Even when it's a government official, it's prosecuted by the Justice Department. But if the Justice Department says, no, we're not going to do that, there is still a remedy. Is there a precedent for this? Has it happened before, Mark?
Yes, it has. And the federal rules of criminal procedure are quite clear that if the Justice Department declines to prosecute contempt at a federal judge's urging, the interest of justice allows that judge to then appoint a special prosecutor who can continue the case and carry it all the way through to a guilty verdict.
Mark just froze there. Lisa, you're nodding your head so vigorously that I think you might hit it on the table.
Katy, I feel really strongly about this because I can anticipate what the reaction is going to be by people who don't like this order. And they're going to say, this is just one more example of Judge Boasberg's lawlessness, that he is floating the idea of appointing a special prosecutor. As Mark said, there's ample authority for it in the federal rules, and there's ample precedent for it, too. Here in New York, several years ago, a Southern District judge, finding that the U.S. Attorney's Office didn't want to handle a criminal contempt proceeding involving a lawyer that he felt should be held in contempt, appointed a former prosecutor to handle it herself. And after he found that lawyer to be in criminal contempt, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld that man's conviction. His name is Steve Donziger. I would highly recommend that the Trump administration familiarize themselves with that case.
I'm going to read a little bit more from this ruling by Boasberg, because, again, it was riveting, and it did feel like I was on the edge of my seat reading it, just following the nuts and bolts, the timeline of how the administration was just defying or ignoring the courts. These are the last two that we have in our system. Hustling class members to an airport before the proclamation had even been published, and in the face of a suit that sought a temporary restraining order was bad enough. The decision to launch planes during the afternoon hearing was even worse. The government knew as of that morning that the court would hold a hearing on whether anyone in its custody could, consistent with the law, be removed pursuant to the act, and yet it nonetheless rushed to load people onto planes and get them airborne. Did the administration know that this would be the end result? Do they want to have this fight?
Oh, I think they're very happy to have this fight, yes.
Why?
Because the president and his team have this kind of long-term goal of just tearing things down and doing the things that he said he would do as a candidate. And they have a way to dismiss anyone who disagrees with them, and that includes the judiciary. One of the things that the president said just over the weekend, I actually was on Air Force One with him a handful of times on the way to Florida and back, and I asked him if he would respect the Supreme Court's call that they facilitate the return of the Maryland man. And he said, I would respect the Supreme Court. And then I said, what about a lower court? And he just kind of shook his head. He respects the Supreme Court, but he's very happy to dismiss these lower courts.
Do they feel like the immunity decision, that's a real slip of the tongue, immunity decision that the Supreme Court awarded Donald Trump last year gives him newfound authority? Does he feel like Does he feel like he doesn't have to operate within the law because of that?
I'm not going to say he feels like he doesn't have to operate within the law. He has said, at least in the Oval Office and elsewhere, that he will follow the rulings of the Supreme Court. But they are absolutely ready to dismiss any judge who they think is taking on the powers that he should have as the executive. And they have used those words along the lines of, nobody elected this judge didn't get tens of millions of votes, I did.
One question on the Supreme Court and how they might rule on this. I question it because when you look at the ruling, Mark, about Kilmar Abrego Garcia, instead of saying exactly what the lower court said, facilitate, what was the other word?
Effectuate.
Facilitate and effectuate Kilmar Abrego Garcia's return. They just decided to use facilitate. They also cited the president's powers on foreign policy. It's something that Stephen Miller has seized on and used that to claim, like, as if the ruling was on his side. Does that give you a little bit of pause as to how they might rule in a case like this, given that the president has decided all these people are terrorists and he says he's trying to work within foreign policy and national security?
It certainly worries me. I think it's a clear signal that the Supreme Court is dodging these conflicts with the Trump administration, trying to save face for Trump, at least for now, and trying to put off a kind of grand clash between the branches. And this order represents exactly that clash. This is a constitutional crisis. I don't think there's any other way to put it. A federal judge finding that the president and his officials flagrantly and proudly defied a lawful court order. Will 5 justices be willing to stand by that and swallow it when they would not stand by the district court judge in Abrego Garcia's case and say, yes, this entire order must be carried out, and gave the Trump administration some wiggle room that they are now exploiting to get around it? I don't know. I think a lot of it depends on when John Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett decide that it's time to draw the line. If that time hasn't come yet, they may well throw Judge Boasberg under the bus again.
All right, so you've been waiting patiently, Max. Let's get to the politics of this. Yeah. We're seeing Senator Van Hollen down in El Salvador today trying to argue for and bring attention to Kilmar Abrego Garcia. Donald Trump still enjoys quite a high rating on immigration and that authority amongst Americans. How do Democrats thread that needle?
So the Trump administration clearly believes that they're setting a trap for Democrats by doing something this heinous, right? Rejecting court orders and sending human beings to what looks like and feels like a concentration camp many miles away. They are wrong, though, to believe that the American people, the majority of the American people, believe in this policy. Yes, the vast majority of American voters believe that there's a false choice between justice and safety for all. And they certainly don't want particularly criminal undocumented immigrants. They believe that they should be deported, albeit with due process. That is not what is happening here under any circumstances. So it is a political high ground for Democrats, and there's precedent for this. Half-decade ago, the Trump administration received very serious and significant political consequences for separating parents from their children at the border, undocumented immigrants themselves. And just a year later, the Democrats flipped the House.
Yeah. But do you think that's going to be the issue here? Because what we saw with the child separations was emotionally horrific. We saw video, we heard sound of children crying. What they're doing right now is they're trying to prosecute, or to not even prosecute, or deport a different class of people that they are deeming as terrorists, people that don't have the same sympathy, inherent sympathy, just if you were looking at the headline, than separating mothers from their babies or fathers from their kids. They are trying to say these people are dangerous criminals. And when it comes certainly to Kilmar Abrego Garcia, they're trying to claim he's a member of MS-13. His lawyers would have an argument against that.
Sure.
But they're also saying that he's a guy that, there was a temporary restraining order that his wife had tried to place against him. It eventually got dropped because she didn't show up for the court hearing. But they're trying to paint him as not a good dude, a bad hombre, as Donald Trump might say, and forcing Democrats to try to defend somebody that is hard to defend.
Yeah. So, look, it's obviously not perfectly analogous. And it's critical in a situation like this that the Democrats not go too far to make any voter feel as if they are standing on the sides of criminals, undocumented or otherwise. This is a very particular situation with two sides of a coin, both of which are not to the Trump administration's benefit. The first is that without due process, they are deporting random people, and Donald Trump has openly said he'd be open to doing that to American citizens. Point number two is they are not sending them back to their home country. They are sending them to a place that is clearly horrific, disgusting, and brings up memories of concentration camps.
Yeah.
The American people are not in support of that. I personally think much higher of American voters. While the Trump administration does not, they will suffer political consequences.
I will say that in the adjoining opinion that Justice Sotomayor wrote, it was signed on by a couple of the other justices. She did say just that if you're going to do this to someone like Kilmar Abrego Garcia, the legal argument that the administration is putting forth, it can be easily applied to an American citizen. Sorry, we've gotten them, we deemed them a terrorist, they're out of the country, we can't do anything about it. So we'll see where this goes. All right, Max Rose, Lisa Rubin, Jeff Mason, Mark Joseph Stern, thank you guys. You made it a lot clearer for me, and I appreciate that.